John Bolton, former national security advisor to Donald Trump, has described the indictment of the former president as very powerful, carefully tailored, and devastating that should end his political career. This is even as the Republican Party largely remains in the former president's thrall, calling his prosecution on charges under the Espionage Act a result of a weaponized Department of Justice under President Joe Biden. A former US ambassador to the United Nations and now a vocal critic of Trump, whom he served for 19 months, Bolton spoke to Mayank Chhaya Reports about theater of the absurd underway in the Republican Party. He also spoke briefly about India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi's state visit to Washington starting on June 21st, describing it as probably going to be the most important relationship over this century. Ambassador John Bolton.
I have been reliably told that of all the shows at your command, you've chosen my show to announce your run for president.
Nice try, really. Very, very nice try. But I appreciate you raising it. I'm still considering it, notwithstanding that there are now a number of people who have said they're running for the Republican nomination. It's still very early, and this is a very strange election cycle in the United States. So I think it's still possible that I will do it, and but I think I've got more time, certainly, than I expected 2 or 3 months ago. And being a potential candidate, really, I think is at this point a very good place to be.
Right. I want to bring your attention to theater of the absurd that's playing out within the GOP, where presidential contenders are falling over one another to issue presidential pardons already, notwithstanding the fact that there is no conviction, that they haven't won nomination, and let alone they haven't even won the election. What's going on? This would be absurd, if not downright risible.
Well, I think some of the people who are saying that hope that this will attract support from people who also support Donald Trump. And I do think the logic of it is there are a lot of people who still think highly of Trump, but recognize he carries too much baggage to have a chance of winning in November against Joe Biden or whomever the Democratic nominee will be. So they're trying to position themselves to say to Trump's supporters, see, I was a defender of Trump. I was prepared to issue him a pardon. So I understand the politics of it, but I agree with the proposition this is not the time to talk about it. The analogy I think that some are thinking about is that Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon after he became president, after Nixon resigned. There is an argument that to try and bring the country back together again, that you want to show, as Lincoln once said, malice toward none and charity toward all, to bind up the nation's wounds. The difference between Nixon and Trump is that Nixon had to resign the presidency. He was forced out. Had he persisted and insisted on a trial of his likely impeachment, he would have been convicted. That's what he was told by the Republican leadership in the Senate. That's what led to his resignation. So in effect, by being the only American president ever to resign, Nixon had been punished in a very profound way. And Ford's pardon came after the punishment. Here, as you just said a moment ago, there's an indictment, but no trial, no verdict. Really, none of that is present. And to solve the problem of that Trump has caused in so many ways in American politics, the prerequisite to that is he has to be out of politics. Then someone can consider pardons or other things that might be appropriate. But we're not at that point yet, and we're in fact nowhere close to it.
Trump's former Attorney General Bill Barr has said that the former president would be toast, even if half of the charges are true. His former Chief of Staff, John Kelly, has said, and pardon my words, scared shitless. And he has never been held accountable before. And you have said that the indictment is very powerful, carefully tailored, and devastating that should end his political career. That being the case, why does a vast majority of the Republican Party, including former President Trump's presidential rivals, remain in his thrall?
Well, I think a lot of them believe the prosecution is politically motivated, and they think Hillary Clinton should have been prosecuted for the famous email issue back in 2016. They think that Joe Biden should be prosecuted because classified documents were found among his records. They think Hunter Biden should be prosecuted. We've just literally had a development on this front moments ago as we speak, that Hunter Biden has entered into a plea agreement in his case. We'll see what comes of that. But the argument is there's a double standard in federal prosecutions, that Democrats get a better deal than Republicans, and particularly get a better deal than Trump. I don't necessarily disagree with part of that. I wrote in 2016 that I thought the Hillary Clinton investigation had been mishandled in several significant respects. But my point would be this to Republicans, to try to get them to appreciate the danger Trump is putting the country and the Republican Party in. You know, my mother used to tell me 2 wrongs don't make a right. Even if it was wrong not to prosecute Hillary Clinton, the issue before us, the only thing we can do anything about at this point, is whether this indictment sets forth allegations which, if proven to a jury, if guilt is proven beyond a reasonable doubt, are very serious offenses. I mean, very serious offenses dealing with critical national security issues. So the decision here to prosecute was put before a grand jury by responsible prosecutors, and another jury will get a chance to consider the evidence, and they may acquit Trump or they may convict him. But on the basis of what I've seen in this indictment, this is very serious, and you don't solve the double standard problem by defaulting to no standard at all.
You have also said that the documents that he reportedly retained could do enormous and incalculable damage to the U.S. security. Now, that damage may already have been done, don't you think? Because of the way if you go by the photographs, the way they were handled, they were for everyone to see there.
Yeah. Well, we don't know for certain. Number one, we don't know for certain what's in the documents, the 31 documents that are listed in the indictment. But what I know from my own service in the White House is that when the president is required to make a decision, the documents that are put in front of him to help him, to give him all the information that we can provide to inform his decision, contain some of the most sensitive information in the possession of the United States government. And if it's that kind of information that was stored in bathrooms at Mar-a-Lago or kept in the president's possession, it's very serious indeed. Now, some people say, but we don't know that the Chinese or the Russians or others have ever actually gotten their hands on these documents. That he wasn't acting as a spy. He wasn't transmitting documents to our adversaries. In fact, we don't know who's had access to these documents. Maybe the prosecutor has information that he can produce at trial that will show that. But right now, we the general public, don't know. The point of the statute under which Trump is charged, the underlying substantive offense, is mishandling very sensitive classified information. And the reason that is a criminal offense is that the law seeks to minimize the risk that people will behave irresponsibly. And by placing these documents in insecure locations, make it more likely that our adversaries can get their hands on them. If you restrict access, you reduce the danger to the United States that its secrets will be revealed. And that is a serious business. It's a prudent thing for any government to do. And that's what Trump is charged for, in addition to being charged with obstruction of justice, suborning, perjury, and a variety of other things when he was asked by the government to give these documents back. So I think when you put all this together, the 49-page indictment, it really is devastating. And I think Trump's got serious problems about how to mount a defense. And the more he talks on television, the more he says, I had a right to the documents. I didn't want to give them back when they were asked for. The more difficulties he makes for himself and his lawyers in the coming trial.
The main talking point of the Republican Party has been that the Biden administration has weaponized the DOJ. I mean, that's a huge charge. Do you think that is true?
Well, I don't think so. Look, I'm an alumnus of the Department of Justice. I served during the Reagan administration. I was an assistant attorney general working for Ed Meese and Richard Thornburg when they were attorneys general. I worked with the FBI, and I've worked with the FBI in many jobs because of its intelligence and counterintelligence functions in this country. And these people are, I think, patriotic Americans. They do their jobs. There are problem children in the FBI and the Justice Department as there are in any government agency, but I don't see any evidence here of politicization or weaponization.
The former president was held liable for sexual abuse. A month or so later, he was arrested again and arraigned on 37 counts under the Espionage Act. He's facing charges of serious business fraud, plus likely charges in Georgia, as well as over the January 6th insurrection. Is there any line beyond which the GOP would be genuinely horrified and say that's enough and jettison him?
Well, look, I think many people in the party are genuinely horrified right now. There's feeling, again, with respect to the New York case, that was politically motivated, and I think it's not irrational to believe that. I wish this federal charge had come first. We'll see what the other investigations produce. The judge in the documents case has set a very early trial date. That's pursuant to what we call in this country the Speedy Trial Act. You know, there's a saying in justice systems that flow from England, justice delayed is justice denied. Ironically, Trump will try for more delay. He will try to delay this until after the 2024 election. So the judges set a trial date in August. Now, that's not going to happen. But I think it shows, hopefully, her determination that we're going to move this along. I think the public interest is to have the documents case tried first before the New York case, before the Georgia case, before the January 6th federal case, and to try it as early as possible. I don't think this trial should be delayed until after the election. There are complications in it, but the public interest here really is that the people of the United States should know whether a jury of their fellow citizens is going to acquit Trump here or convict him. And I think that's important evidence for them in making up their minds who they're going to vote for in November of 2024.
In the event that a conviction happens and incarceration results, and he goes on to win the nomination and even presidential election, we will have an extraordinary situation of a convicted felon into the White House. Why is it that the founding fathers have allowed this to happen, in the sense that if I'm a criminal convicted, why do I have this kind of ability to rise to the top level?
Well, they never anticipated we'd produce a Donald Trump. I think that may be the short answer to the question. It was a time they believed in civic virtue. They believed in responsibility. And they just didn't foresee that voters or the Electoral College would ever elect anyone who had been convicted of these kinds of serious offenses. But I think that that's something that has not yet fully sunk in on the Republican side of things. The notion that we would nominate not just somebody who's been indicted, that's bad enough, but somebody who's been convicted. To me, that's a further reason why the public interest here in weighing what is the most appropriate time for the trial of this indictment to take place. The answer is the public interest suggests it should be much sooner rather than later. Now, Trump's entitled to mount his defense. Nobody should try and railroad him. That would just make for more claims of weaponizing the Department of Justice and the court system. But he's been on television quite recently saying that he was entitled to the documents. He could do what he wants. Well, if that's his position, let's get to trial and see what the jury thinks.
When the world looks at the United States now, on the one hand, they see a former president ensnared in so many things, and yet he continues to retain so much popularity within the Republican base. And on the other, they also see the justice system working efficiently. Do you think this in any way undermines America's moral standing or even posturing when they deal with world leaders? They might turn around and say, look at your own country. I mean, you have a former president held liable for sexual abuse and he still retains so much traction.
Yeah. Well, I think this question of how to hold Trump accountable is being handled in the way that it should, and he's managed to escape accountability for many years before he became president. But he's in serious trouble now. I mean, nobody should underestimate that. And the issue here really is a race against time for him and for the system. If he can delay things until after the election, at least with respect to the federal charges, then he's obviously in a much better position. But if the system can meet that standard that we've inherited, that justice delayed is justice denied, then I think he will be held accountable. And the voters at that point, I think, will have a profoundly different reaction. I do also think that within the Republican side, as people consider the gravity of what's happened here and the possibility of further charges that could come this summer in the Georgia case or the other federal case, at some point you get so many rocks in the bottom of the boat that it sinks of its own accord, and that could happen too.
Just last two questions. You worked with him for close to 19 months, I think. What do you think his obsession is with documents and things like that?
You know, I think a lot of reasons have been suggested. I think he was a pack rat. He was an accumulator of things that reminded him of being president, of having a piece of paper that's highly classified that he could say to himself or to others, "I've got this and you don't." It could be that simple. It could be that he had motives with respect to some of these documents to extort foreign leaders to use for commercial transactions. I don't rule that out based on my assessment of his character. I don't know for sure, and I don't think we will know until we see the 31 documents, which is a separate problem for the prosecutor of whether and to what extent those documents can be declassified. Fortunately here, the motive why Trump collected these things is not legally relevant, and it's not necessary to prove at trial. Again, the prosecutor knows a lot of things we don't know publicly. He didn't put everything in the indictment, and it's adds to the reasons why an early trial is important, to put the full case in court before the American people, not just for the jury that will judge Trump's guilt or innocence, but for the public who can see what the bigger context of this case is.
To conclude, nothing to do with this current theme, India's Prime Minister will be in Washington the day after tomorrow on a state visit. What's your perspective on the way the US-India relations is going, especially in the context of China?
Well, I think this is a very important visit. I think that the bilateral relationship between India and the United States over the rest of the century is probably going to be the most important relationship both countries have. And certainly how to deal with China will be the most important question facing both countries. Now, in this country, in the US, there's a lot of speculation about what direction India is going to take. There are some who know India well, who say that India is hedging its bets between China and the United States. It doesn't want to move in one direction or another. It's a democratic country. It can make its own decisions. But let's be clear, the threat here to both of us is coming from China. And I think the steps that Prime Minister Modi has taken with the Asian Security Quad, Japan, Australia, India, and the US are very important. I hope that concern over the safety and security of Taiwan will be a major subject of conversation between the two leaders. There's a lot to talk about. I understand the history for India since independence and difficulties that poses, but I think the job of any national leader is to look at threats to his or her country, and figure out what the best way to keep the country secure is. And I hope what that means is that India and the United States will draw closer together in many ways, but particularly in the security cooperation field.
With that, I have yet again finished in the stipulated time, Mr. Bolton.